Welcome, as Jenny said, to everybody, especially a welcome to all of our new assessors and new deputies. For those of you that were at the new assessor training as part of the assessor conference last week, this will seem very familiar to what we presented last week, so I'm sorry, but we just wanted to make sure we cover all of our bases. So today, Devin and I will be presenting. I'm the Assessment Division Director for the Department of Local Government Finance, and Devin Harris is our statistician with the Assessment Division. He came over to us last March 1st from our Data Analysis Division, so this will be his first full year to go through the process, the ratio study review and approval process. So we will be splitting up the presentation, going back and forth. So you'll hear my voice, you'll hear Devin's voice. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Devin and he'll start off and tell us what we're going to be learning about today. Devin?
Yeah, as you can see, this is just a quick summary of what all we're going to get into today. We're going to start off with, I'll give a definition of just what is a ratio study, and we'll talk about your deadline for submission, as well as the time period for the sales you'll submit, and what sales are candidates to be submitted for the ratio study. Next, we'll go over sample versus population and how we can make samples representative. Then lastly, Barry will go over the components of the ratio study submission, all the different files that you'll want to have submitted in order for us to start your ratio study approval process. And then lastly, as Jenny has mentioned, we'll have a time for questions, so you can queue those up in the chat bubble up top, and we'll get to them at the end. So to start, like I said, the definition: a ratio study is a sales-based study meant to measure how accurately we assess property value. To do this, we look at the relationship between assessed values and their market value in use. What we really want to do is make sure of two things. First, we want to make sure each county's mass appraisal model is uniform, same across the board. And secondly, we want to make sure the administrative and statutory standards have been met, because if we can do those two things, we can be confident in the accuracy and the consistency of assessments. So quickly, I'll turn it back over to Barry, and he'll tell you a little bit about the property classes and a few other things.
Thanks, Devin. So as you can see, there are 6 property classes that are included in the ratio study: vacant and improved residential property, vacant and improved commercial property, and vacant and improved industrial property. Agricultural property is not included, in part due to the agricultural land base rate is determined by our office. These are the 6 property classes that are included or should be in your ratio study. In 2020, we started a process using Microsoft Teams to do or conduct the ratio study process. And the reason we did that is previously ratio studies would be submitted by paper or on CDs, and we just wanted to ensure uniformity, consistency in terms of the submission. We also found that submitting the ratio studies via Microsoft Teams improved our communication and the timing or the timeliness or timing of our responses. So we found that the past couple of years, it's been a very effective way for counties and their vendors, if they have one, to submit their ratio studies to us. And the communication has helped enhance the efficiency of our review and approval process. If you do not have Microsoft Teams, it is available through a desktop app. You can see the link there. If the Teams asks for a password, it's your Windows login credential. So please make sure that you get your login now. Here we are in late January, and we'll talk about the timeline, but we'd much rather have counties working to make sure that they have login credentials through Microsoft Teams now versus later before the ratio study is due. We did have one county contact us yesterday where apparently their Microsoft Teams was removed, and we do have a guest access to Microsoft Teams. So if you do have any issues with Microsoft Teams, please contact us. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Devin. Our contact information will be at the end of the webinar, or Julie Waddell, who's also in the assessment division. She can help with our Microsoft Teams. Because we do have several new assessors, there may be some assessors that have not yet signed in or added. So please reach out to us. There may be also individuals that are no longer employed, or former county assessors that are no longer with the county, that they need to have their name removed or their link to us removed. So please reach out to us now just to make sure we have everybody that should be on Microsoft Teams linked in, so we can get your information and make sure we're set to go well before the ratio studies are submitted. As you can see, also, we always ask or request that you keep your Microsoft Teams open. This helps in terms if there's any notices or information that comes in, say, after hours. This way we don't lose time in terms of the review or approval process. In terms of submitting the ratio file, the ratio study files to our office, you would want to use the 2023 channel. Obviously, you can see the different ways in terms of what you do, the steps you take to upload the files with our office. And also, we would request that you tag or notify myself and also Julie Waddell in the conversations tab to let us know that you have submitted your ratio study. If we are not tagged or notified, we will not know that your ratio study has been submitted. So certainly don't want to miss anything. When we do receive your ratio study, your upload of your information, we will be acknowledging that in Teams. It'll be either myself, or if I'm not able to, Julie will acknowledge your submission. So I won't go through the process, but you can see what you need to do in terms of the steps to upload the files into Teams. So Devin, tell us, what is a ratio study?
Yeah, to start, we have to know what the ratio in ratio study means. And the good news is that it's a pretty simple ratio. It's just the assessed value over the sales price, as you see here. And on the next slide, we'll talk about it a little bit more. So what we do is group similar properties together and compare the assessments to the sale prices of other similar properties, and then compare those to the market value in use. And as you saw for a quick second on the next slide, I've just got a quick couple of examples just to give you an idea of what the ratios look like in practice and then what they mean. So on the left here, we've got a property with an assessed value of $100,000 and a sales price of $150,000. That ratio would come out to 0.67. And on the other side, we have a property still with an assessed value of $100,000, but a sales price of $80,000. That ratio is going to come out to 1.25. And the main takeaway here is that if a ratio comes out to less than 1, that means the property is under assessed. And alternatively, if the ratio is more than 1, that's an indicator that the property is over assessed. So I will pass it right back to Barry, and he'll talk a little bit more to you.
Sort of like a tennis match, watching the ball go back and forth from court to court. I do want to stress in this is obviously the example is just showing an individual sale and not the aggregate, the mass assessment scale. And so the ratio studies I want to indicate is done on a mass appraisal basis versus an individual assessment basis. But we'll get into some of the requirements for the ratio study in terms of the statistical standards it must meet. But I think this is a good representation to for a taxpayer to see if they were to compare their assessed value with their sales price, is my property under assessed, over assessed, or hopefully that may not be an exactitude, but hopefully we are getting close to 100% as far as the assessed value goes as we get closer and closer to market value and use. So in terms of the time period for your ratio study, statutorily it is due by March 1st. And as you can see, the sales window is January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2022. Assessing officials, we started this last year. We did not have anybody do this last year, but we did start this last year, that assessing officials may use a different or an alternative sales window. In this case, say, for example, November 1st, 2021 to October 31st, 2022. The key is it must cover at least 12 months. And if you do use an alternative time frame, we have internally decided it should not go back more than 2 months. In other words, it should not have any year's worth of sales prior to November 2022 as far as the full year length. After this morning's webinar, we did have one vendor reach out to us and said he was looking at using a different time frame a lot sooner than the November timeframe, and we had to politely indicate that getting past anything past 2 months, that you could, it may not necessarily represent or be close to the January 1st assessment date. So that's why we went with 2 months, and instead of allowing a county to go back, say, 3 or 4 or 5 months, certainly a lot. If you look at what's happened in the real estate market the past in, say, 2022, the first half of the year, sales were still going pretty strongly, and then the second half, sales tended to slow down a little bit. So we want to make sure that we have sales as close as possible to the January 1st assessment date. But if a county, in order to submit their ratio study timely, wanted to use an alternative sales window, they could. I've indicated or spoke about this previously. The assessors are sort of the leadoff leg of the relay race in terms of getting on-time billing done. And by that, I mean the assessor is required to submit statutorily required to submit their sales to our data analysis division, their 2022 sales, by February 1st. So that's coming up in a week, a little over a week. And then statutorily, then by March 1st, they submit their ratio study to us. So if the county is delayed in submitting their sales and or submitting their ratio study, that potentially could put on-time billing in jeopardy down the road. So please make sure to submit your sales by February 1st, and then also submit your ratio study to our office by March 1st. In regard to the time period for sales, we realize and understand that, especially maybe in some rural areas or maybe some different classes of property, commercial or industrial property, that some counties may need to use sales that are slightly older than 1 year. And the maximum or there should be sales that are no more than 5 years in duration that are used in the ratio study. And if you do use sales that are older than a year, then those sales must be time adjusted. And this is in accordance with the IAAO standard on ratio studies that we've incorporated into our real property rules. And the question is, well, how do I time adjust the sale, or what is the amount? And there's no set guideline that specifies that it must be a certain percentage or a certain amount. I think most assessors, if they're looking at time adjusting their sales, will look at the inflation rate or the consumer price index, the CPI, and use that as a guideline. And certainly inflation has been increasing the past year or so. But if you look back to, say, 2019, 2020, and you use the CPI, that might be a good guide in terms of time adjusting your sales. But anything over a year, those sales must be time adjusted. All sales, you can see all sales are candidates for submission to for the ratio study, unless sufficient and compelling information can be documented to show otherwise. Well, what would make a sale not potentially be used in the ratio study? And that could vary. It could be that there's a sale that's not an arm's length transaction. Maybe it's a situation where relatives are involved, a family member selling, parents to a child, or between cousins or something like that, or if the sale is under duress, as a result of foreclosure, whatever the case may be. But we would expect all sales initially to be candidates or to be included in the ratio study. As far as it goes, after the sales has been received the compliance status by our data analysis division, we will generate a list and send to you a list of potentially valid sales. And these include sales, as you can see in those property classes, 300 to 599, which would be your commercial and industrial through residential property classes. And this would be for any sale that is above $1,000 and do not have any special circumstances marked. So if there are any sales without a special circumstance marked, they must have an explanation on the sales reconciliation file. So to give you an idea of what we are looking at in terms of a universe, you can see here there's 3 different sections or circles. So if you were to start with the sales file, this would be the overall sales file that you would be submitting to our office. And then if you were to break it down and say, okay, what sales would be included in the ratio study, that circle, that universe is shrunk. And then finally, when we get to the potentially valid sales, you can see that that circle is decreased. There are no set parameters or guidelines, but certainly if a county was only using 25% of the sales, potentially valid sales in their ratio study, we would be questioning them and saying, why, why didn't you use, more sales? And there may be valid reasons why not all sales are used, but we would hope to see as many sales used as possible. The reason being, the more sales that are used, the better assurance and insurance that we have that we're getting closer to market value and use for properties. So Devin, I'll toss it over to you now. Can you talk to us about sample versus population?
Sure. Yeah. As Barry said, the quick examples I gave of the ratios earlier were of individual property ratios. And what we're going to be looking at is groups and populations, whole populations of ratios. And so we're going to end up with a lot of these individual ratios. And if we look at just one property or even at one particular group of properties, which we would call a sample, we may not come up with a ratio that matches that of the population, which would be an example of a non-representative sample, and that's not our goal. We would like our samples to be as representative of the population as possible. So by definition, for a sample to be representative, this is when the ratio distribution of the sample is as close as possible to the ratio distribution of the population, which you see here. These are 2 graphs called histograms, and I won't go into too much detail about what they are, other than the fact that these are visual representations of distribution. You can see they look roughly like mountains, and we can learn about the distribution by looking at where the top of that mountain lies, left to right. That tells us where most of our data is. Other things that we can learn about the distribution by looking at graphs like this are how skinny or thick the mountain is and whether the mountain is lopsided. And what we want to see from a sample is we want it to look as much like the population when it's graphed out like this as possible. And on the left here, we have a population, a whole population of 902 properties. And on the right, we have the visual representation of just a sample of 77 of those properties. And when looking left to right on each of these graphs, we can see that the peaks are both just under 1. It's okay that they're both a little different in terms of how far away from 1 they are, but they're roughly in the same spot, which is good. That's what we're looking for. They both relatively have the same shape. One's not way thicker or skinnier than the other, and neither one is lopsided on either direction. So that would indicate to us that the sample is roughly the same distribution as the population, which makes it a representative sample. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what representativeness means in the ratio study context and how we can make things more representative and how to avoid making things less representative, because that's possible as well. So representativeness is improved when major property characteristics present in the population also show up in the sample proportionally. So an example that I've been giving is that if we take any county and they might have a lot of improved commercial properties. Let's say they have more than the average county does, but this year's sample, if it doesn't have as many improved commercial properties, then chances are things aren't going to be distributed as we would expect, and representativeness is going to be down. In one way or another, we want to find a way to increase the representativeness. One way could be to expand that sales window so that it includes a more proportional amount of improved commercial sales. But really, that's just one of several different ways where you can improve the representativeness of the sample. Now, on the next slide, I'll talk about things we want to avoid because they hurt representativeness. So, for example, if you selectively reappraise properties based on the sales price, and if those end up in the ratio study, representativeness goes down and the inferences that we make with the data are going to be inaccurate. And in this situation, measures of appraisal level are also not going to be supportable unless you use the exact same appraisal model across the board for sold and unsold properties. And that's why the next slide tells us that it's imperative that assessing officials incorporate a quality control program to ensure that sold and unsold parcels are appraised at the same level. Now, to go on about representativeness and to get a little even more in depth about in context what representativeness should mean to us, there are 4 main ways to improve or ensure representativeness. The first is that the procedures for your sample should be as similar as possible for the procedures that you use for the corresponding population. Second, you need to have a plan in place to ensure that unsold property improvements are not constantly flying under the radar, even those without permits, which we understand is not the easiest of tasks, but it's imperative that you both have a plan in place to make sure that unsold improvements are not going under the radar, and then you also need to relay that to us so that we can see evidence of you doing everything that you can as a county to make sure that those are not flying under your radar. That may be door-to-door flyers, that may be where you're relying on taxpayers to tell you when they've made improvements, or it may be something as simple as driving by and using your eyes to see that's different than the last time we saw it. So let's take note of that and include that in the appraisal. Those things are really important. So, and then third, it's important that the distribution of the proportion types, or the distribution of the property types in the sample are as similar as possible to that of the population. This goes back to the example I gave about the improved commercial properties. If those concentrations are not alike enough, then the distributions are not going to be alike enough, most likely. Lastly, it's important that sales have been appropriately screened and validated. And so on the next slide, we're going to see some of the important IAAO standards for key statistical measures found in the ratio study. To start off, the ratio, this is in terms of average ratios for a property type, a certain property type. Those are going to need to fall between 0.9 and 1.1. Next, we have coefficient of dispersion. Oftentimes we'll refer to that as COD. That's a numerical measure of equity. And for residential improved, that number is going to need to fall under 15. And for real property, it'll need to fall under 20. Next, we have price related differential, or PRD. This tells us whether low value properties in a class are over or undervalued in relation to high valued properties. And that number is going to need to fall between 0.98 and 1.03 for each of your property types. It is important to note that for groupings with fewer than 20 sales, we use a different metric for to look for vertical equity. That's called Spearman rank. It's the same, it's doing the same thing, but it's just better equipped for telling us or finding vertical inequity for smaller samples, for groupings with 5 to 20 sales. If there is vertical inequity, then it's going to need to be corrected. We'll reach out to you and ask you to correct that. We will also conduct the Mann-Whitney test. This is a test for equal appraisal between sold and unsold properties. We're going to review all neighborhoods and that have a statistically significant difference between sold and unsold parcels. So if we notice that there's a significant difference, then we're going to, for those neighborhoods, we'll request explanations for specific parcels, and you will tell us what your reasoning is, what the reasoning is for those differences being a little more extreme than what we would normally see. For this, we get a lot of simple answers that involve effective age, just saying the reason for this large change was effective age change. We wanted to use this platform as a time to tell you that that isn't quite specific enough, or at least it's not enough on its own to get you past the Mann-Whitney part of the approval process. What we need from you, in addition to that explanation, is you need to provide evidence of your standard operating procedure for the effective age changes that details what's being done, what you're doing to ensure equity across sold and unsold properties. What we're looking for when you tell us that a major shift is due to effective age change is that we need to make sure you have a plan in place that ensures equity across the board between those sold and those unsold properties. Because it's so common, it's best practice to include that standard operating procedure in your initial submission, your narrative submission. That is because if we get to that point in the process and we have some Mann-Whitney things for you to explain, if you've already submitted that in your narrative, then when you tell us in your explanations, those are just effective age changes, we don't have to then reach back out to you and ask you for that, for your standard operating procedure. We'll already have it on file. We can refer to that, and then it'll be as simple as that, and we can send you on your merry way and send you down the line to Barry for the rest of the approval process. And so similarly, I'm going to pass it back to Barry for the rest of the presentation, where he'll tell you a little more about what we are expecting submission-wise.
Thanks, Devin. I appreciate that. I want to start off before we talk about the components of the ratio study, that all of the ratio studies are public record, public information, and we have on our website is in order to be as transparent as possible. We have all of the ratio studies submitted by the counties, the narrative, and the approval letters. So this is used by a variety of people. You may have taxpayers, you may have tax representatives, you may have, we've been contacted by several legislators wanting to know or see what is going on with their county and their specific ratio study. So please do know that ratio studies are public record and they are on our website for anybody to review it anytime they'd like to. So in terms of the components of what you're submitting to our office, your ratio study submission, we'll start off with the formatted tabs, and I'll get into the formatting in a little bit in terms of why it's so important. We talked about the 6 major property classes that you should have a separate tab for, and then your ratio study should also then include a summary tab. Your ratio study would also include the workbook. The workbook would show all the assessed values, the sales reconciliation file, and then the narrative template. And the narrative template is key, and we'll get into several things about the narrative here in a couple of minutes. So in terms of formatting your ratio study, before we will begin the review process, it must be properly formatted. And we will be putting out ratio study guidance here in the very near future, and we will include samples of spreadsheets with examples of what is a correctly formatted ratio study, and then also what is an incorrectly formatted ratio study. So formatting is one of the key things in terms of the ratio study. In regard to the narrative template, this is another key area that we focus on, and that is start off with, if you have any assessed values where there's a change of something greater than 10%, and the change can be positive or could be negative, those explanations must be included in the narrative template. And so explanations could be something like, if you had new construction, you had a new office building or a new factory or a new hotel or something like that, that's what's causing the greater than 10% increase. Or conversely, if you had something that reduced your assessed value by greater than 10%, perhaps it's a factory that was closed and torn down, or buildings that were demolished, whatever the case may be. But in the narrative template, please include any explanation of why things changed more than 10%. 10% is a subjective amount. We could easily have said 5% or 25%, but we thought 10% was a fairly representative amount in terms of any changes that we're seeing. The changes also for greater than 10% could be due to just the annual adjustment process. Certainly, we've seen sales around the state go up significantly in the past couple of years, although it's cooled off a little bit. That could be a very valid reason why your assessed values in certain property classes, especially say residential, why your assessed values may be going up more than 10%. So please be as descriptive as possible. As Devin indicated, with the explanations, your standard operating procedures, just simply stating, the reason for this change was effective age. Well, that's not quite going to make it. You need to be a little bit more descriptive. But if you said, per our standard operating procedure, we do XYZ in terms of determining effective age, and you provide a copy of that, that would suffice. So just the more information you can provide, the better. Otherwise, when we go through our review process, we will be contacting you if there's something that's not, if it needs something a little bit more definitive in terms of your answer, or if something's not complete. As far as the change in the values from prior years, our analysis would be based on the current year class code, both the current and the prior year, as far as the information goes for that. Also, one of the key things that's happened in the past year or two has been an increased focus on the land order. And in fact, last year we ended up having to have a land order hearing for one county that was successful, but the land orders are increasingly coming into greater public scrutiny, so to speak. So I know some counties will conduct their land order just once every 4 years, which is fine. Other counties maybe have switched to doing their land order every year, or at least that part of the cyclical reassessment. So if you did complete your land order in 2022, please note that in your narrative template. And as you can see, any other changes that might help answer questions, sort of being proactive and letting us know that, hey, this was a change because of this or that, whatever this situation may be, please let us know. The narrative template is the same as last year, so there should be no changes. If you have any questions, you can always go back and look at last year's template to see what was included or what was asked in the narrative template. As far as things that might cause the delay or delays in getting your ratio study approved, I mentioned a little bit ago about the assessor's importance in terms of the relay to get on-time billing. Certainly, we as an oversight agency want to get your ratio study approved as soon as possible, but there may be some things that might cause a delay in getting that ratio study approved. And the first one, and I think probably the most common one, is just incorrect formatting. So please, if you have any questions about formatting, please reach out to us. But formatting seems to be one of the leading causes of delays in getting your ratio study approved. Another one is just insufficient explanations on the reconciliation, either not responding or providing an explanation or just being vague. So please provide as much information as possible. I mentioned the 10% change in assessed value, be it positive or negative. So if your narrative does not explain what happened, we will be reaching out to you, and that could cause delays. Another thing is delayed responses to messages. I mentioned in terms of the Microsoft Teams, making sure we have your updated contact people. We would suggest or highly recommend that there be at least 2 people from each county, be it the assessor and a deputy, or assessor or a vendor or whomever, that they are on the teams. That way, in case someone is out of the office, if they're sick or unable to respond, that the county, that the vendor is getting the information and they are being able to respond to us as soon as possible. Another reason or thing that could cause a delay is if there's no explanation for how or why you grouped properties, be it the neighborhoods or maybe in rural counties grouping commercial and industrial properties together. So please, as much as possible, provide as much information that you can. Another thing that could cause a delay is for vacant sales, that the total AV should only be shown to reflect the land value. So if you had vacant commercial property, for example, we would want to just see the vacant land sales. It should not have improved values with that as well. Some of the things are case sensitive, so make sure if you have something, you use a capital uppercase Y and an uppercase N. Also, non-multi-parcel sales should have a Y in the primary column. You should be able to match your cyclical reassessment totals in your workbook with the cyclical reports. And by that, I mean, we should be seeing similar amounts that were used for phase 1 of the cyclical reassessment. We just completed phase 1 of the 4-year cyclical reassessment, so those should be able to be matched up. And then finally, when looking at your ratio study submission, there may be various things that cause changes to the ratio studies, but there shouldn't be new workbooks or ratio studies filed uploaded after your initial submission. So those are things that might cause delays with your ratio study. But now let's look at things that you can do proactively that can help get you timely approved. The first I mentioned this or talked about this is getting acquainted with teams. If you're a new assessor or new deputy, learning how to submit. And certainly at this point in time, if you wanted to reach out to us via Teams and say, am I submitting this correctly, or are you seeing this message? We certainly would be happy to respond to anything right now, just to make sure that the lines of communication are open and what you would be doing is correct. Another thing is to make sure that all your files are correct, and making sure everything is formatted. I've talked about the information on the narrative and making sure everything is included. Devin talked about the standard operating procedures in terms of, especially with effective age, but it could be for other things that your office, that you do during the annual adjustment process that would help us understand more, get a better understanding of what you're doing in terms of the annual adjustment process, and which is reflected in the ratio studies. I mentioned teams and keeping that open during the process. We do have people that we're working after hours as well. So keeping the teams open will make sure that you get the messages from us as soon as possible. And then when we do notify you that you are responding or reviewing as effectively, as soon as you can. Just to give you a brief overview of what happens when your ratio study is reviewed, or the approval process we go through. When your ratio study is submitted to our office, you will receive, as I indicated, a notification that we've received it either from myself or Julie Waddell. Our ratio study, then Devin will go through and make sure everything is formatted and make sure everything is good to go for review. We will then assign it to one of our field representatives, and they will be your initial contact. They will reach out to you to let you know that they are reviewing the ratio study. They'll do their initial review. If they have any items that need to be reviewed or corrected or changed, they will send you a checklist. Then you respond to that checklist. Hopefully, we only have to go through that once, but it takes 2 or 3 times. That's how it goes. Once that initial review is completed, John Toomey and Chris Wilkening are our second reviewers. They will then review that ratio study just to make sure nothing was overlooked or missed, whatever the case may be. Once they are done with their second review, they will forward it on to me, and I will review it. And then once I've reviewed it and I'm satisfied, then I will forward it on to Commissioner Wes Bennett, and Commissioner Bennett will then review it, and he'll send me the thumbs up in terms of an approval, or if not, if he has any questions, then I'll reach back out to the assessor and or their vendor to let them know that there was a question raised. Once it is approved, we will send out the approval letter, and then once you receive the approval letter, then you can proceed to get ready for the next step, which is to make sure that your Form 11s, your notices of assessment, are sent out by April 30th. So that's the general process. In terms of our review process, we have an internal metric. Our internal metric is to review and approve ratio studies within 5 days, business days, and we've had some ratio studies approved in the same day, and we've had some that have taken a lot longer, depending on the nature of the issues or the problems. One of the things you can do to also help get timely approval is, Devin mentioned the various IAAO standards, the PRD, the COD that we're looking at. Maybe before submitting your ratio study, you do your own analysis to make sure that you do fall within those statistical parameters. Also, I just want to remind everyone that even though an assessor may have a deputy assigned or have a vendor working with the submitting the ratio study, ultimately the elected assessor, county assessor, is responsible for having an approved ratio study. So the burden falls on the assessor to make sure everything is done completely. terms of references or other information that you can look at or go to, I indicated that we, the Department of Local Government Finance, have adopted or promulgated by reference the IWO standard on ratio studies, and you can see the link to the IWO website. There's also a standard on verifying and adjusting sales, a standard on the mass appraisal of real property, and then finally, the last thing is our administrative code provides information in terms of the ratio study. So if you ever had any questions about what we look at, what's required, those are good resources that you can reference. So with that, Jenny, have we received any questions?
Yes, we did get one or two. I'm sorry. We had one question. What if we don't have an assessor?
What if you don't have an assessor? Well, we just went through the election process and all 92 counties elected an assessor. So each county should have an assessor. There are 13 township assessors, but the county assessor, even for those counties with the county assessor, or even though for those counties with the township assessor, the county assessor is the one responsible for submitting a ratio study. So I'm not quite sure where that question is coming from, but each county does have an elected, duly elected county assessor, and they are responsible for the ratio study.
And I would add to that, if you are unsure of who your assessor is, feel free to reach out to us and we will be happy to get you in contact with them. Okay, our next question is, how does the inclusion of personal property affect the sale price for the purposes of the ratio study? For instance, a vacant commercial lot that includes personal property in the parcel sale price.
Okay, Devin came to us from our data analysis division, and he can talk a little bit more about what we look at in terms of our data analysis perspective, looking at the sales file. But certainly, when you're looking at a sale price for a property, say a vacant land sale, and it has some personal property included. I'm not sure the property is vacant. I'm not sure what personal property would be included. Typically, when we see sale prices, it's going to be, or personal property, it's going to be for improved property. I'm thinking now, if you had a property that's on a body of water or a lake or something like that, and the house, property is sold and it has a couple of jet skis or a boat or something like that, where there's personal property, that personal property should be identified on the sales disclosure form, and it would be excluded. The personal property would be excluded from the sale price, in terms of looking at it from a ratio study perspective. But Devin, anything you can think of in terms of the question that Jenny just posed?
So yeah, you can correct me. Feel free to correct me if I say anything that you don't agree with, but my kind of interpretation of the question, or how I would answer my interpretation of the question, is just that the importance of the personal property being included into any commercial or industrial residential property would be what we are so focused on, is the market value and use. And if that personal property is going to increase, or hopefully not decrease, the market value and use, that is important to us. So if the personal property is adding to the value of that property and it's going to cause it to sell for more or then we want to assess it as worth more, if that makes sense. Barry, does that fall in line with both the question and what we are standing for here?
I think so, and hopefully if the person who submitted the question can provide a better explanation or a better example, certainly we'd be happy to take a look at that. And as Jenny indicated, we will compile all the questions and provide responses, just to make sure that everything is answered or responded to correctly. I've included, you can see the last slide is my contact information along with Devin's contact information and our website information as well. So if you did have anything specific or more needed more clarification, please reach out to us if you had any further questions. So Jenny, what other questions do we have come in?
We don't have any other questions right now. We can leave the chat open for a few more minutes in case anybody does have anything that they want to submit. But I did want to remind everybody that we will be sending out the presentation, as a PowerPoint and PDF, the survey, the video link, as well as the CE form after the session today. You will get that as an email if you pre-registered. It'll also be available on the DLGF website, so you can access that at any time. The video will be on our DLGF YouTube page, so that will be available at any time that you can access it. You can also share it with staff members that may not have been able to attend today, that it would be important for them to be aware of this information. As Barry and Devin have indicated, please feel free to reach out to them if you have any questions. You can also reach out to me and I can get you in contact with them or another appropriate person. We do want to make sure that if you want CE credit, that you submit that, fill out that form. You're going to self-report it and send that to Donna Bratcher within the office, and we will get that recorded for you. I want to thank you all again for attending today's webinar, and we will see you in a few weeks. We have 2 webinars available in February that you may want to take a look at and participate in. So we will see you in a few weeks. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much.